Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a pretty fascinating, data-driven journey through a whole century of American economic transformation. We're going to break down exactly how American families lived, worked, and spent their money, starting right at the dawn of the 20th century all the way through to the modern era. We'll be digging into some incredibly detailed historical data to really unpack the true story of the American wallet. So, let's kick things off with a somewhat jarring question. Seriously, take a second and think about this. Could your household survive on just $750 for an entire year? I mean, it sounds completely impossible today, doesn't it? But to really grasp the modern economy, we have to instantly anchor ourselves in the stark, gritty reality of the past.
Back in 1901, $750 wasn't just pocket change. That was the average annual income for a household in the United States. And remember, that wasn't just disposable income. That was literally the entire pool of money a family had to cover food, housing, clothing, and absolutely everything else for 12 full months.
Now, brace yourself for some serious financial whiplash. By the 2002 to 2003 timeframe, that average annual household income had skyrocketed to just over $50,300. That's a staggering 67-fold increase over the course of a single century. We're talking about a total, fundamental reshaping of the economic landscape. The source for all this incredibly detailed information is a massive, meticulously compiled report by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, aptly titled 100 Years of U.S. Consumer Spending. They essentially took a longitudinal look at demographic and spending data to give us this massive 100-year history of how the American standard of living actually changed. Section 1. The 1901 Household Reality.
So, who exactly was the average American family back then? Well, the population in 1901 was overwhelmingly young. The median age was just 22.9 years old. The demographic breakdown was about 87.9% white, and the workforce was distinctly male-dominated. We're talking 80% of men participating in the labor force compared to just over 20% of women. Families were also notably larger, averaging about 5 people per household. But perhaps the most surprising fact by today's standards, America was overwhelmingly a nation of renters. Only 19% of families actually owned their homes, meaning a massive 81% of families were just renting their living spaces.
Section 2. The Daily Wage Grind. Digging into the historical wage ledgers provided by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis exposes a pretty grueling reality about how that money was earned. Laborers across various states were routinely pulling massive 54 to 60-hour work weeks. In a lot of cases, people were grinding away for up to 72 hours. And for all that time, for all that sheer physical toll, the daily rates often hovered around just $1.50 to $3 a day. It was an absolute grind just to scrape together that annual $750. Because wages were so incredibly low, surviving the 1901 economy couldn't just fall on one person's shoulders. While almost 96% of households relied on earnings from husbands, the data highlights that over 22% of households actually relied on the earnings of children. On top of that, over 23% of families had to take in boarders or lodgers just to make ends meet. The home really wasn't just a place to live, it was a necessary economic engine for pure survival.
Section 3. Surviving on pennies. So where did all that hard-earned money actually go? Out of an average household expenditure of $769, an incredible 42.5% went to food alone. Toss in 23.3% for housing and 14% for clothing, and you suddenly realize that a massive 80% of a family's entire income went strictly to basic bare-bones survival necessities. That left just 20% for absolutely everything else: health, transportation, education, you name it.
But here's the real kicker. Even with spending almost entirely on the bare necessities of life, the average family was still operating at a financial deficit. Household spending actually exceeded income by 2.5% on average. Think about that. They were working 60 hours a week, putting their kids to work, renting out rooms to strangers, and they were still slipping into the red just trying to survive.
Section 4. An unequal labor market.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to point out that this average experience was deeply fractured by systemic inequalities. The historical wage ledgers show a stark contrast between male and female laborers, for instance. Women working in the exact same industries, pulling the exact same grueling 54 to 60-hour work weeks, were consistently earning a fraction of what men earned. The data repeatedly shows women's daily rates capped at under $1 or $1.50, while their male counterparts were making up to $3 a day. We also see clear economic divides when looking at research data analyzing the Jim Crow era. According to detailed modeling provided by the National Bureau of Economic Research, there was a pronounced racial wage gap. Using models that control for human capital and occupational fixed effects, the data illustrates that occupational segregation drastically restricted the earnings of marginalized communities. The impartial historical reality is that your economic experience was highly dependent on exactly who you were and what the systemic rules of the day allowed you to earn.
Section 5. The Century of Consumption. So how did we get from there to the modern era? Well, over the course of the 20th century, basically everything transformed. Average household expenditures didn't just inch up, they exploded, experiencing a 53-fold increase. We moved from spending roughly $769 a year to an average of almost $41,000 in the early 2000s. And this wasn't just higher numbers on a ledger. It represented a fundamental shift in the way American families actually lived their lives. Now, you're probably thinking, what about inflation? And you'd be right to ask. Inflation plays a huge role here, but we definitely can't ignore the true value of the dollar. The Bureau of Labor Statistics notes that the $40,000+ spent in the early 2000s would have bought over $2,000 worth of goods back in 1901 prices. That means the standard of living fundamentally, structurally transformed. We're looking at a literal tripling of true purchasing power for the average household. What we're looking at is a massive economic pivot. The United States transitioned from an economy grounded in domestic agriculture and basic survival to a massive global services machine. Mass consumption became the defining characteristic of modern society. And this was heavily fueled by the rise of modern advertising and the widespread easy availability of consumer credit. People were no longer just buying what they needed to stay alive. They were buying for leisure, for convenience, and frankly, for status. In fact, consumer spending grew so much it became the single largest component of the entire U.S. gross domestic product. Which brings us to a final thought to wrap up this explainer. Over a century ago, an American family spent over 80% of everything they had just to keep a roof over their heads, food on the table, and basic clothes on their backs. So take a look at your own wallet. What does your budget actually look like today? How much of your income goes to pure survival, and how much is dedicated to modern comforts those 1901 families couldn't have even imagined? It's definitely a fascinating way to look at how far we've come. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the data around you.